EQs, right? That's really the thrust of today, is to discuss EQs and what they do. Let's use the full-length word for what an EQ stands for is equalizer. And an equalizer basically can be used to rebalance harmonic structures in an audio signal. Everyone's got a car with a tuner in it, or with an amplifier and an EQ section with bass, treble, and so on. What you're doing when you turn those knobs is actually adjusting the harmonic structures. You're adding more high-frequency harmonic structure or more low-frequency harmonic structure, which is more fundamentals versus the harmonics, and you can readjust that. Now remember what we said, we're talking in the frequency domain right now, but there's another domain that it's linked to that you can't get away from, is the time domain. So when you actually add more high frequencies, you're making the envelope of the sound in time, the corners much sharper, the attack much sharper. When you add low frequencies, you're making the release of the envelope much longer. Remember our square wave example? The corners of that square wave had to have high frequencies to fill them up when we're talking about the addition of sine waves to create a complex waveform. That's why high frequencies are the square wave part, or the more square part of the envelope, the attack, and low frequencies are more of the release, roughly speaking. So it's nice to keep that in mind as we discuss this, even though we're going to be in the frequency domain discussing this. Think of what happens in the time domain of a sound. So if I have a sound in time and amplitude, and at some time I hit the snare drum and then it decays, if I add more high frequencies, this attack is going to be more aggressive and more sharp, meaning more high frequencies. If I add low frequencies, the decay is going to be longer. It's going to have more depth to the sound in terms of low frequencies. This is more attack, more depth in low frequencies in terms of thickness. Okay, so that's how it relates to what you're hearing. Now, there's different kinds of EQs, and they're all useful for various things. Because if you know what you want to do to a sound, getting the right tool for the job is really important, right? If you're a carpenter, you don't want to use a power saw when you need a little coping saw. And, you want to use the right tool for the job when you're hearing in your head how to make that sound right. So let's go through the types of EQs that you can use and what they're good to use for. Okay, so passive EQs, as we sort of alluded to maybe a week ago, or when we were talking about resistors and capacitors, if this is frequency and amplitude, there's no power source to this. It's all passive elements, a resistor and a capacitor put in a circuit can create this kind of a roll-off. And you can make this resistor variable, which moves this frequency back and forth. That's exactly how a tone control works on your guitar, because the guitar doesn't have, some guitars have active circuitry, but say a Strat coming right out of the factory has passive circuitry, and it's called a passive EQ, only passive components. Okay, active EQs, on the other hand, have amplifiers, so that you can get, this is only cuts in passive. It cuts frequencies, which makes you think that there's more low frequencies. Because you always have to remember this. This is sort of a fun, and I probably should have made a card for it. This is sort of a fundamental principle. When you're mixing something or EQing something or listening to something, you have to have a frame of reference to know where the frequencies are. If we're talking about all even frequencies at all even volumes, then you remove high frequencies, all of a sudden it appears that you've added low frequencies, right? You can look at it in both ways, right? It's kind of like when you're mixing, and instead of turning the vocal up, you turn the music down. It has the same effect. So you've got to think of these things in both perspectives, because it'll really help you in terms of your projects that you're working on in your computers, or when you're working with EQ. So instead of adding, sometimes you remove to get the same effect. In fact, I almost encourage removal rather than adding, because people tend to just add until everything's out of control and distorted. So it's much better sometimes to just, I've got another story, but when I used to work with bands and we used to all mix, right? And we didn't have computers to make moves of volume moves. I was working with a band And I made the mistake of telling the vocalist, okay, you work the vocal faders, and the drummer, you work the drum faders since you know drums, and the guitar player, you work the lead guitar faders. Pretty soon, they got the idea, hey, I want to hear more of myself, and they kept pushing it up. And then the other guys, hey, I can't hear myself enough. They push it up. Then they can't push. Then pretty soon all the faders are at the top, and we got no mix at all. So I got wise, and I said, okay, you drummer, you're working the lead guitar. Lead guitar player, you're working the vocals. Vocalist, you're working the drums. Then pretty soon I noticed that instead of pushing up, they learn. I could pull the drums down so I hear more of my vocal. So I can pull down to be able to hear more of myself. Those perspectives work really well in mixing, and many times it's better to pull down than to push up. Uses of EQs, okay? General use of what an EQ can be used for. It can be used as a corrective device to fix or restore a sound that was recorded poorly, compensate for bad recording, restore a frequency balance that wasn't recorded well. If I'm doing my own recording, I never really have to do that because I don't record it unless it sounds right. But many times I'm sent stuff from people that have recorded in different environments. They think it sounds great, and when I hear it in my room, I realize how deficient it is. So I use EQ to try to correct what they are missing. And my favorite way to use EQ is to enhance a sound, make it sound better, or create an effect. So when I say make it sound better, what do I mean? If you think of spectrums, when you bring more fundamental in, you hear more pitch. When you bring more harmonic structure in, you hear more quality of the sound. So the cymbal sounds more like a cymbal. The acoustic guitar sounds more like an acoustic guitar. So when you brighten something, add a little high frequency, your piano sounds more lifelike in the recording. So those are important things to remember when you're using EQ. And the tendency, and I'll just say this out loud, especially if you're not really experienced at EQ, the tendency is to over EQ and to over add because, yeah, it sounds better. So 1 dB of 7 kilohertz sounds good. Maybe 2 dB sounds better. Wait a minute, 3 dB sounds even better. And pretty soon you've really twisted the sound out of shape. Even though it sounds really good soloed, it'll be really difficult to make it match in with any other sound in your mix. And you're really twisting it out of reality. So what I always start with is, how does the piano sound in the room when I'm standing next to it and somebody's playing? That's the sound I'm trying to get. I can over-enhance it and make it sound even more lifelike, and that's great for some circumstances, but in general, if you do that, you're going to get into a real mess down the road. You can always add more. You can always take away. So I try to be very gentle and very consistently controlled with how much I EQ. I've seen people EQ the weirdest things. They take off this frequency, they add that frequency. It's like, how did you come up with this? Don't get so extreme on me. You're going to really, especially if you recorded the sound in the first place like a vocalist, and you know it sounded reasonably good when you recorded it.